Parenting plays a pivotal role in our society. Whether undertaken by mothers, fathers, grandparents, siblings, or others, the upbringing of the next generation determines the future of our species. Each new generation is affected by the values, beliefs, practices, and experiences of the former, as the influence of the adults around us during our childhoods help determine the kind of adults we become. From culture to culture, parenting methods reflect what the parents in those cultures value most. Parents in hunter-gatherer or subsistence agriculture societies are likely to promote practical survival skills from an early age. Some indigenous cultures in the Americas, such as the Quechua in Peru and the Nahua in Mexico, cultivate pro-social behavior in children by facilitating their contribution to their communities from an early age. The activities their children do blur the lines between play, work, and learning. Kipsigis parents in rural Kenya value a form of intelligence in their children often elsewhere overlooked, one that combines innovative thinking and social responsibility. There's no such thing as a perfect parent, and there's no one-size-fits-all method of parenting. But there are methods of parenting that cultivate autonomy, and there are methods of parenting that cultivate subservience to authority. Unfortunately, the latter has gained much greater prominence, especially among colonized people. A combination of the Puritan legacy and the violence of slavery has spread the practice of corporal punishment, which has perpetuated trauma in our communities for far too long. The Puritans enforced total obedience from their children through violence, justified by Proverbs 13:24, which reads that whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. One New England minister, John Hrdy, advised parents,
"Whatever pain it costs, conquer their stubbornness, break their wills if you will not damn the child. Therefore, let a child from a year old be taught to fear the rod and cry softly. Make him do as he bid if you whip him 10 times running to do it. Let none persuade you that it is cruel to do this."
As a result, generations were raised in an environment of fear and might makes right. Generations were raised in an environment that equated love with violence. Generations have suffered the frustration of their parents venting through violence on children unable to defend themselves. These ritualized beatings were introduced to colonized and enslaved black populations who felt they needed to regulate their children's behavior with spankings to cultivate fear and obedience in them in an attempt to spare their children from the whipping wrath of their white masters and the pervasive threat of lynching. This practice has unfortunately continued in many homes to this day, with similar justifications. Even absent of corporal punishment, which has long been proven as damaging and ineffective, parenting in our society often acts to enforce compliance with the way things are. Children are seen as the property of their parents, who essentially have unilateral authority over them. Without a radical approach to child rearing, parents simply help the child affix the mask. New African Anarchist Ashanti Alston's term for the psychological prison that suppresses our autonomy. Unlike the Hadzabe, whose centuries-old traditional parenting practices reflect the need to cultivate autonomy and pro-social behavior in a tight-knit community, a lot of our modern parenting advice has been divorced from tradition and experience. In fact, as British writer Christina Hardiman discovered, much of our modern parenting advice, concerning babies and toddlers in particular, has come from the seesaw and advice of centuries-old pamphlets written by male doctors and intended for foundling hospitals, where nurses had to essentially industrialize child rearing in order to care for the dozens or even hundreds of abandoned children all at once. The advice that babies need to be fed and slept on a particular schedule, or that babies must sleep alone, derived from the musings of 18th and 19th century doctors in the very early days of pediatric medicine. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences has also included consequences for parenting, particularly with the increased promotion of the nuclear family above the extended family. Now, I'm aware of the naturalistic fallacy, the belief that what's natural is always better. But to echo the American psychologist Dr. Christopher Ryan, the naturalistic fallacy is only fallacious up to a point. While it's true that what exists in nature is not necessarily beneficial, It's far more likely to comport with our biological reality than something with no roots in the natural world. We can ignore our body's need to move around and sit at our desks working all day, but not without increased risk of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, stress-related mental illness, and other ills. Dr. Ryan uses the example of shoes. We can disregard the natural shape and function of the human foot, but not without injurious consequences. We can and should override our evolved nature, but only up to a certain point. As American anthropologists Sarah Blaffer, Hrdy, and others have observed, we have evolved to raise children in a network of supportive social relationships with near continuous skin-to-skin contact, positive touch, free play with multi-age playmates, and proximity to loving caretakers. Our earliest experiences as infants should be communicating that we are loved and welcomed and respected by people whom we can trust, not sending us a message of struggle and loneliness. Parenting should not be left to an isolated unit of one or two parents alone, as the ideology of extreme self-reliance promotes. Child rearing does not need to be so miserable for all parties involved. The way we parent needs to change. Future generations don't need to go through what many of us went through. But what does that look like practically? We don't need to start from scratch when it comes to rethinking parenting. Not only are there centuries-old cultures that provide more mindful models of parenting, but there are also plenty of experiments happening in the modern day. Take, for example, the Montessori method, developed by Italian educator Maria Montessori in the early 20th century. Similar in some ways, though far more rigid and far less politically radical in intent than Spanish anarchist Francisco Ferrer's modern schools, the Montessori method seeks through practical play and experiential learning to develop children's natural abilities and initiative. Teachers in mixed-age Montessori classrooms act as guides as students explore maths, language, science, practical life, and sensorial subjects at their own pace. Montessori schools can be found all over the world. It's a fairly popular, though often inaccessible, pedagogical method. The parents of Montessori kids practice the Montessori method at home as well by introducing ways to respect and foster a child's freedom and independence. Montessori practitioners believe in something called freedom within limits, in the sense of letting a child guide their own daily activities based on their interests while communicating what is or isn't acceptable, such as activities that may hurt themselves or others. Another progressive parenting approach that has gained quite a bit of notoriety recently has been gentle parenting, or intentional parenting, or respectful parenting, which aims to raise confident, independent, and happy children through empathy, choice instead of commands, respect, understanding, and setting healthy boundaries. According to Destiny Bennett, a fairly popular gentle parent on Instagram and TikTok, gentle parenting is about creating a movement towards ending generational trauma and toxic social norms. Instead of focusing on punishment and reward, gentle parenting focuses on improving a child's self-awareness of their feelings and understanding of their own behavior. Gentle parenting requires a tremendous amount of patience. It's quite time-consuming compared to a lot of other methods of parenting because it doesn't lean on the shortcuts of reward and punishment to change their behavior. It takes time to get to know a child and tailor your approach to suit them and their development. You have to work on being a good example yourself so that the child has a good model for keeping you cool, being kind, and being conscientious. In a similar vein to gentle parenting is the composite practice of team parenting, coined by American journalist Michaeleen Doucleff in her book Hunt, Gather, Parent, where she explored the parenting approaches of Maya families in Mexico, Inuit families above the Arctic Circle, and Hadzabe families in Tanzania. The term team refers to the key principles of the method: togetherness, encouragement, autonomy, and minimal interference. Togetherness refers to the need for a pro-social approach to parenting, one that facilitates the already embedded importance of working and being together with others. In some indigenous Maya communities in Mexico, the children have developed an almost unusual level of self-sufficiency and helpfulness to their families, taking initiative and doing tasks like cooking, cleaning, and otherwise without being asked, threatened, or lured with rewards. That's right, these kids work without the profit motive. Checkmate capitalists. Maya parents help their children cultivate a lifelong skill called acomedido, which is a combination of situational awareness, knowing how to respond to situations in a way that benefits the family or community, and an eagerness to spontaneously assist. The three key watchwords for developing acomedido are practice, model, and acknowledge. Toddlers, especially, are very eager to help, to be around parents, siblings, and caregivers, and to feel like part of the team. Sometimes it could be a nuisance or an inconvenience, trust me, I know. But we need to cultivate that trait instead of discouraging it. We need to show them what being part of a team looks like by including them in family responsibilities and activities, and we need to acknowledge their efforts without disrupting their intrinsic motivation to be helpful. Encouragement is another key principle of team parenting. Rather than forcing a child to comply with a request or behave in a certain way through control and punishments, the idea is to encourage a child to listen, learn, and behave properly. As absurd as it may sound to some, this idea isn't without precedent. There's a whole toolkit that parents can use to develop a child without force. Take, for example, anger management. Anger toward a child is just unproductive because it only feeds into a cycle of anger and stress in the parent-child relationship. Ending the cycle can be as simple as responding to the child with kindness and calmness, thereby giving the child an opportunity to find that response in themselves. Modeling the behavior you want to see is probably one of the most effective methods you can use to change behavior in the long term. You give calmness to receive calmness. Alongside the acomedido watchwords of practice, model, and acknowledge, parents can also utilize nonverbal cues, questions, consequences, physical touch, play, and even storytelling to guide children's behavior. It feels like oral storytelling has become almost a lost art, but it was likely crucial for the development of our species. Every culture in the world tells stories because stories are often the best way to communicate ideas, skills, and histories. And stories are still one of the best ways to train children. Take, for example, the Inuit myth of Kalupalik, the sea monster that steals children who wander too close to the water. Or to draw from a more local example, the duendes of Trinbagonian folklore, the faceless, backwards-footed lost spirits of dead infants who trick children to getting themselves lost in the bush by mimicking their parents' voice. Just like adults, children don't like being bossed around. Thus, team parenting emphasizes the importance of autonomy. When children don't have autonomy, it makes them feel powerless over their lives, which plays a large part in generating the levels of stress, anxiety, and depression among the youth today. When we constantly interfere with the agency of children, we undermine their confidence, problem-solving abilities, and self-reliance. That don't mean we don't try to influence their actions, but it should be done in a way that allows the children to maintain a sense of agency and minimizes conflict. But what about the behavioral consequences of this kind of freedom? Don't free children turn into spoiled, selfish brats? Well, not so among the Hadzabe in Tanzania, whose children are kind, considerate, and cooperative. The Hadzabe have been living fairly similarly to the way their ancestors lived for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. This isn't because they haven't been exposed to other social arrangements, but instead because they believe their way of living is optimal for the land they inhabit. And by the way, the land they inhabit is being threatened. They have a reciprocal relationship with the land, giving back to it and receiving from it in turn. This gift economy also applies to their familial relationships, where instead of using control and domination to raise their children, they focus on giving to each other. The parent-child relationship is one of reciprocal love, companionship, food, and responsibilities. Children as young as 5 and 6 move freely, speak freely, emote freely, and act freely, without coercion or micromanagement. Yet they still contribute to their communities. They still contribute to their families. The values of their community are what makes the difference. You see, spoiled children are given license to walk all over their parents and others. They're never told no, and they do whatever they want at others' expense. They have more rights, not equal rights. Hadzabe children, on the other hand, and free children in general, have something greater than just freedom and independence. They have autonomy rooted in community. While an independent child is disconnected from others and responsible only for themselves, an autonomous child is responsible for their actions and decisions in the context of a constant connection to community. They're expected to be generous, helpful, kind, and cooperative. The parents of autonomous children give them opportunities to practice sharing, model sharing to themselves, and acknowledge when their children are acting selflessly. Of course, there will be conflict between parents and children, just as there are conflict between adults, but they're meant to be resolved through discussion, not domination. Which brings us to the final core principle of team parenting: minimal interference. Parenting without the shortcuts of bribing, threatening, admonishing, lecturing, or forcing children. Unless their freedom is restricting the freedom of others, children need autonomy so that they may learn to solve problems on their own or cooperatively while still being protected by their parents, learning key cultural values, and being encouraged in ways that accentuate their intrinsic motivation to better themselves and contribute to the collective. I think there are elements and practices present in the Montessori method, in gentle parenting, and in team parenting that can help us develop a broadly anarchic approach to parenting the next generation. But I don't believe that these approaches alone are automatically radical. Without addressing and organizing against the intersecting systems of oppression responsible for the current state of the world, these progressive parenting strategies can end up feeding right back into the status quo. An anarchic approach to parenting must be decolonial, feminist, anti-racist, and just broadly anti-hierarchical if it aims for liberatory ends. One interpretation of anarchism is as a constant process and method of recognizing and dismantling hierarchical systems and relationships, replacing them instead with horizontal and egalitarian methods of organizing ourselves and relating with one another. It's not necessarily an end goal, but it's a process. The parent-child relationship is typically held up as an example of a so-called justified hierarchy, but I don't believe parenting must necessarily be hierarchical. Yes, there is a potential power disparity within the parent-child relationship, but that doesn't mean we don't do everything we can to flatten that disparity so that children can develop themselves as self-determining beings in an egalitarian social web. Recognizing these disparities and working toward minimizing them is far better than pretending they don't exist or accepting they do exist and using them as justification for authoritarian approaches. The vitality of community in child rearing should not be overlooked. It is exhausting to parent alone, even more so in ways that are liberatory. Isolating parents, and especially mothers, with a monopoly on care work has bred contempt, anxiety, and postpartum depression. Children are designed to be raised by a group of caretakers, and not just casual interlopers that drop in every once in a while, but 5 or 6 key people who can distribute the responsibilities of parenting. It takes a village is not a metaphor. It is a description of the evolutionary vitality of a variety of caretakers, children and adults, related and unrelated, called alloparents in child rearing. Allo comes from the Greek term for other, but that doesn't mean alloparents are sidelined. They are absolutely essential for providing care and bonding to children. Deep, close friendships are just as important as food and exercise in raising healthy children. Children need caretakers who can provide them with active quality time, positive communication, affection, feedback, and support. Communally conscientious caretakers that model positive behaviors, communicate the logical consequences of misbehavior, and provide healthy coping mechanisms and self-regulation strategies so that we can help guide the next generation into kind, caring, open-minded, respectful, cooperative, and autonomous human beings. All power to all the people, including the little ones. Peace. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share with your fellow peoples. Thanks once again, of course, to the family, including our newest members, Khalil Bentley, L. Jameson, Waddington Nation, Operation Rhiannon, Talia Parkinson, Benin, Whitaker S., Blake S., R. DeAngelo, John N., Trickster, and Marco Dablitz. Join these beautiful humans and support me too on patreon.com/sainttrue. Check out all my other videos for a range of radical topics. Follow me on Twitter @_sainttrue. Thanks again. Peace.